myth about writing that I didn't understand until recently. An approach toward writing that almost every writer uses that makes success little more than a matter of luck. You see, recently I heard something that made me stop and think. Create the marketing before the product.
Now, some of you are saying,
a novel's not a product, it's a work of art that you create yourself. And to some extent, I agree. And if you don't care how many people read your book, what I'm going to say next probably doesn't apply to you. But if you're like me and you really want readers to enjoy your work, then keep watching. You see, there are two basic approaches toward creating anything. The creator first approach, where you simply make whatever it is you want and then find a way to make it appealing to people, or the consumer first approach, where you figure out what is maximally appealing to people already, then create something to give them what they already want. And this dichotomy leads us right to the myth I led with. All our lives we hear some variation on this writer's success story. Aspiring author writes a bunch of things they find interesting, submits them to agents and gets rejected often, keeps sticking with it, and eventually is picked up by a publisher, becomes a famous author, and lives happily ever after. But here's the problem. This not only focuses on the slim few who manage to write something publishers think they can sell, it also singles out the even slimmer few who publishers can actually sell. Unfortunately, this fairy tale ignores the countless writers who aren't able to get so lucky. And if you're writing without even thinking about the reader, then you are relying on luck for your success. But I don't want to rely on luck, and if you're still watching, you don't want to either. So what's the alternative? That's what I'm going to explore over the next 2 days. I'll be creating the marketing for my novel first. This includes the premise, title, cover, tagline, and back blurb, all before outlining a single word. And by doing this, I hope to create a cohesive novel and lay the foundation for a series readers will actually want to read.
now the first thing we need to do is figure out what types of readers I would actually like to appeal to. There are many approaches to doing this, some more consumer first than others, but the way I want to do it blends the consumer first and creator first approaches. So I'm going to draw inspiration from the author that I like reading most, Brandon Sanderson. So here's the logic. There's already hundreds of thousands of people who like reading the types of stories Brandon Sanderson tells. I also love these types of stories as well and would love to write a story like that. And even with Brandon Sanderson's dedicated pace of putting out books, there are already tons of readers who would like to read these types of stories more often, myself included. So why not try to write something that would appeal to these readers and tide them over while they're waiting for the next Sanderson doorstopper? Now, the reason I like this approach so much is that I'm writing something that I know will already appeal to other people, and I'm getting to write something that I already love. First, I'm going to break down the common components of these types of Sanderson style stories so that I can get some ideas for which components I would like to include in my story and have a better idea of what to show to people in the marketing, in the book cover, the title, and all that stuff, so that people feel like the marketing accurately reflects the book content itself. I started off here by just looking through some tropes from The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance. However, I quickly realized that there were many tropes included in these stories, and that some of them are more characteristic of the way that Brandon Sanderson tells stories, and some are just, things that were included. Rather than continuing to dive deeply into these TV tropes until the end of time, I decided to just think about some commonalities in the way that Brandon Sanderson tells stories and the style of stories that he tells. I'm just going to take what I've got, what I've learned here, and dive right into the actual marketing aspects themselves. So specifically, I'm going to start off here with the premise. So once again, I'm going to be drawing inspiration from the way that Brandon Sanderson uses premises. I'm going to see what sort of promises the premises are making to the reader and how I can create my own premise that feels sort of similar to this, but also promises a compelling story that would appeal to these sorts of readers. So I just finished looking through the premises. I'm getting some idea about how the marketing department at Tor created these premises. So there's a few things that I noticed here. First of all, there's a premise for each separate POV character. Normally in a smaller scale story with only one POV character, you might only have a 1 to 2 sentence premise, but because this story is told from multiple perspectives, each character has their own arc and each character needs their own premise. And I did notice a few common elements among these premises, like having a strong element of conflict and also the fact that there are fantasy words used that are not relevant for our actual world, and thus really make the book feel like it fits in the fantasy genre. And those are kind of more obvious things about these premises, but one really interesting thing I did notice is that each premise promises a different sort of subgenre within epic fantasy. So for instance, if we look at the Way of Kings, the premise for Kaladin promises some sort of fighting and military fantasy. The premise for Dalinar promises military fantasy and also an element of mystery. And the premise for Shallan promises political intrigue and mystery. So each of these premises themselves is hinting at a different element of epic fantasy and making the book feel like part of that genre. So now that I've done this research, I'm going to try my hand at creating some of these premises myself. I already do have a good idea of the premise for the first POV character, but these other ones I'm not sure about yet. I'll be honest, I was getting a little bit confused because I've never tried to write a trilogy before, or at least not from the start, and because of that I wasn't really sure what the scope of this first book should be. And if I don't know the scope of the first book, it's hard to know what the premise is for the second POV character. I basically just came up with like some general overarching story stuff. At least having that basic structure lets me know, okay, the story ends here in the first book, and that gives me an idea of what I can promise in this premise for this second character. I'm actually going to take a little bit of a break here and eat some breakfast, and when I come back I'll finish up with the premises for all three of these characters. Premises took a lot longer than I thought they would, but I think I've gotten some pretty good premises worked out here. I'll put them on the screen if you want to read them. So the main thing that I did focus on with these premises is making sure that each one points to a little different aspect of the genre. So for instance, the first premise points toward more of like a political intrigue, adventure sort of story. The second premise points toward more of like an uncovering mysteries sort of story, and maybe a little bit of political intrigue too. And then the third, and then the third premise points more toward like a military fantasy sort of story. Now that I've finished working on these premises, the next thing that I want to focus on is titles. I knew that fantasy often had titles of a predictable format, but I wanted to verify that this is true for both traditionally published and self-published novels. So I just finished looking through a bunch of different fantasy titles in different series, both traditionally published and self-published, and I also looked more at some of Brandon Sanderson's books. The books in the Steelheart series are one-word titles, and also Oathbringer, I totally forgot it's one word, and Warbreaker. Long story short, as I was looking through, I realized that a lot of these titles are 2 words or 1 word, or they have the typical pattern. So I think what I'm going to do is just come up with some ideas for both of these, short title ideas and typical fantasy pattern title ideas, and we'll see which of these I actually like better. So I just finished creating a bunch of titles, and I bolded the ones that I actually like reasonably well. And in this process, I learned how difficult it is to come up with titles, especially titles that are short. 2-word titles or shorter are very difficult to come up with, especially ones that feel significant or feel like they have some punch to them. Otherwise, a lot of them just feel kind of flat for me. I like the longer ones a little bit better. The something of something feels kind of official. There's like weight behind it. That the really adds on something. Anyway, I've been trying to come up with titles for a very long time so far. So I think what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to call it for the day, and I'll be back to look over these titles again, give them another look when my brain's a little rested, and see if some of these pop out to me as actually being cooler than I thought, or maybe they generate some new ideas for different titles. I didn't make as much progress as I thought I would have today, honestly. The titles and premise took a long time, so hopefully we'll be able to work through the last 3 things tomorrow, including the title. So I'm back, and I'm ready to continue working here. Before we get started today, I do want to make one note here. That is, these things can change afterward. I'm not setting this stuff in stone. The title doesn't have to be exactly what I choose here today, but by getting a good idea of what the title will be, as well as the other aspects of the marketing, before I go into outlining, I can make sure the title and the other aspects of the marketing are reflected in the story that I'm telling. Thus, if somebody likes the marketing, if somebody thinks that the marketing of the book is interesting, then they should like the story as well. So one of the major benefits of doing this first is actually focusing our stories. I don't think I said that yesterday, so I just want to make that note here. Now let's get into actually working on these titles. First thing I'm going to do is just go through, look over the titles I came up with yesterday and see if they give me any new ideas, see if some of them stand out to me as being particularly cool or titles that I really like, and then I will decide what title I'm going to go with. So this is really hard. I have some titles that I like, but it's really hard to narrow them down. I've gotten down to 4. I still like some of the ones from the last round that I got rid of, but I think these are the best. So this is what I've got right now. I have got The Lost Coalition, The Burden of Heirs, The Heir's Obligation, The Forgotten Oath. I think that either The Burden of Heirs or The Heir's Obligation is best title for this first book. The Heir's Obligation specifically pertains to the main POV character for this book, the one that's going to get backstory and that we're going to have the most character growth from. So I like that one for that reason, but I like The Burden of Heirs because it actually could apply to every single character in the story, even though one of them is not even remotely related to some sort of like royal role. He is technically the first son in his family, so he's not inheriting very much of anything though. I'm gonna need to take another second to decide on this one. This is a really hard decision. So I have arrived at a title. I am going with The Burden of Heirs. So with the title out of the way, the next thing that I want to work on is the cover. Obviously, cover design is a very complicated thing. It can take a very long time and you need a professional to do it. And that is why I'm not actually creating the final cover or anything like that. What I'm going to do is just kind of brainstorm concepts for the cover. What do I want to be on the cover? What sort of covers are out there? What sort of covers are used in the genre? What sort of covers would make this book feel like something that the typical Sanderson reader would be interested in? So that's what I'm going to be trying to figure out now. So I just spent a while looking at these covers, and there are two sorts of patterns that I noticed among the fantasy covers. First, we have the object cover. This is some sort of fantasy object or symbol front and center, usually on some sort of background that looks a little bit gritty. That's one sort of cover option. The other, and this is the one that I'm going to go with, is some sort of character set in some fantasy world. And these worlds are very clearly secondary worlds. They look different. They convey some sort of sense of wonder. And usually the character themselves is wearing something that makes them feel like they are from another world as well. So I think that's kind of the concept that I'm going to go for here. I'm not going to design a cover, obviously, but I do want to capture the idea that I have for the cover. I might do like a general sketch on GIMP and just like draw out a little bit because I have my own ideas, and then I'll also just find some images that represent it. So I was looking for a while online trying to find various images that might convey what I want to capture with this cover. Unfortunately, I did not find anything that conveyed what I wanted. So instead, what I did was I drew a very, very basic design for this cover. So check out what I've got so far. So as I said before, I'm going for a character cover where there's a character in the front and an obviously fantasy world in the background. I was just doing this in a very, basic way. I'm not trying to go too crazy here and design a ton of things and spend a ton of time drawing this perfect image. In the actual cover, the way I envision it, since the Western Coalition values beauty, these buildings and their village would be a very beautiful, very otherworldly place. And it also works alongside the whole burden concept, like the burden of heirs. We could guess that this is one of the heirs on the cover right here, that part of his burden is going on some journey to this place that he doesn't know at all. And that is central to the story for the main POV of this book. And the main point of designing this cover in advance is to just remember what I am promising to the reader, what sort of story they are expecting when they see this, and to make sure that I'm delivering on that. So now there's only two things left that I want to focus on. The first of these is a tagline. I'm not sure if I'm going to use a tagline. I've seen them, here and there in fantasy. So I'm just going to check that these are actually a thing on other covers, or that they're commonly used, or that there's something that Brandon Sanderson uses, or, Tor uses. So I'm going to see what I can glean from this and see if I should actually bother coming up with this and just do a little bit more research. There were a few that had taglines, and enough that, I might as well come up with this. I only have this and one more thing left to work on, so what's the harm of coming up with it? It gives me a little bit more kind of specificity on what I'm promising the reader, and I can potentially use it if it makes sense. So I've just been thinking about a bunch of different taglines. I came up with some favorites here, and I narrowed them down to a few finalists. And I'm not sure which one I like the most yet. So we have every heir must pay a price. Desperate times call for ultimate sacrifice. With great power comes great sacrifice. Honestly, I think I'm going to go with every heir must pay a price. That's one of the first ones that I came up with, but it just feels nice. First of all, it has the heir thing in it, which is in the title as well. So it's kind of connecting them, and it can apply to all three characters. So that's it for taglines. And now we can move on to the very last step, which is creating the back cover blurb. So it's been a long time coming. I've wanted to do this for a while, and now I'm finally getting to write the blurb for a story before I outline. So I'm going to start here by looking at some blurbs from books that I've read, and especially books by Brandon Sanderson. So I'm going to read through some of these and find some common elements. I looked at a bunch of back cover blurbs, especially those on the backs of Sanderson covers, and I discovered a bunch of different things that they had in common. So some of the basics were including a sentence that hooks, making it fit the genre and the tone of the book, keeping it short, and keeping the sentences and paragraphs simple, giving small hints about each character and the conflicts of the story. Those were the general ones, and then more specific to Brandon Sanderson's style, he starts off with these short one-sentence hook paragraphs. They're like a few words just to hook the reader in the beginning. There's simple hints for each of the characters. They're really simple, really basic, and there's more of a focus on the plot than the characters. They leave off with a big question at the end of the blurb, usually. Oh, and of course, there's at least some sort of nod toward the magic, and potentially some basic information about how the magic works. So after discovering these details, I went into crafting my own back cover blurb, and I feel like I've gotten something pretty good here. I mean, I took a few drafts. I kind of kept it to some of those Sanderson things, like using simple sentences in the beginning to hook. And if you want to read the back cover blurb, I'll put it on the screen right here.
When I first realized the potential usefulness of working on the marketing before doing any writing, I worried the process might be tedious and clinical. But by designing the marketing of my novel to fit a specific type of reader, I gained crucial clarity about my story. And by mirroring the marketing of my favorite author, I created a story idea that I would love to read and one that I'm thrilled to write.